The suburban landscape of Doylestown, Ohio, in the 1960s was, for many, the epitome of the American dream. Manicured lawns, two-story houses, and the comforting hum of community life. Yet, within one seemingly ordinary home, a quiet despair was taking root, slowly twisting the psyche of a young boy named Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Born in 1960, Jeffrey was a shy, withdrawn child, whose early life was marked by a peculiar fascination with death and a growing sense of detachment from the world around him. This detachment would, in time, evolve into a chilling void, a vacuum of empathy that would allow unthinkable horrors to flourish. His parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, were a tumultuous pair, their marriage a constant battlefield of arguments and emotional volatility. Lionel, a research chemist, was often preoccupied with his work, striving for scientific precision in a home that lacked emotional stability. Joyce, highly intelligent but prone to dramatic mood swings and hypochondria, filled the house with a chaotic energy that often left Jeffrey feeling ignored or overwhelmed. He later recalled his parents' constant fighting, often escalating into screaming matches, as a pervasive soundtrack to his childhood. This domestic discord, a stark contrast to the quiet, controlled world he sought, undoubtedly contributed to his retreat into his own mind. From an early age, Jeffrey exhibited behaviors that, in hindsight, were profoundly disturbing. His first foray into this dark fascination began with dead animals. While other children might recoil, Jeffrey found himself drawn to them. He would collect roadkill squirrels, birds, cats, and meticulously dissect them in the woods behind his house, driven by a morbid curiosity to understand their internal structure. This wasn't merely childhood experimentation. It was an intense, solitary obsession, a ritualistic exploration of death that isolated him further from his peers. He learned to clean bones, to preserve tissue, developing a macabre skill set that foreshadowed his later atrocities. His father, Lionel, even encouraged his son's interest in biology, unwittingly providing him with tools and materials for these macabre experiments, believing it to be a sign of scientific aptitude. He saw a nascent chemist, not a budding necrophile. As Jeffrey entered adolescence, his social awkwardness intensified. He struggled to connect with other children, often retreating into his own world of dark fantasies. He was an outsider, a quiet observer of the vibrant social dynamics that seemed to come so easily to others. This social alienation, coupled with burgeoning homosexual desires that he found confusing and deeply shameful in the conservative climate of the era, fueled a growing sense of isolation and internal conflict. He longed for connection, for control, for a way to manage the overwhelming anxieties of his internal landscape, but lacked the emotional tools to achieve it in healthy ways. His academic performance, once promising, began to decline. He would often arrive at school disheveled, sometimes even appearing intoxicated. Alcohol, he discovered, provided a temporary escape from his anxieties, a numbing agent that allowed him to interact, albeit awkwardly, with others. He developed a reputation as the class clown, using crude humor and feigned drunken antics to gain fleeting attention, a desperate attempt to belong. But beneath the surface of this manufactured persona, a darker compulsion was beginning to stir. His fantasies grew more explicit, more violent. They were no longer confined to dead animals. They began to involve human bodies, driven by a perverse desire for control, for absolute possession. He found himself drawn to the idea of a completely compliant victim, someone he could keep, someone who wouldn't leave. This deeply disturbing fantasy was a direct reflection of his own feelings of powerlessness and abandonment, amplified by his parents' eventual, acrimonious divorce in 1978. The divorce was a devastating blow, particularly for Jeffrey. His mother, Joyce, left Doylestown with his younger brother, David, leaving Jeffrey, then 18, alone in the house he had grown up in. Lionel moved into a nearby motel, only checking in periodically. For Jeffrey, this abandonment was the final catalyst, pushing him over the precipice into the abyss he had been circling for years. The house, once a battleground, became a tomb of loneliness, a breeding ground for his darkest desires. He had complete, unsupervised freedom, a dangerous gift for a mind already teetering on the edge. It was during this period of profound isolation and unchecked freedom that his fantasies began to take a terrifyingly real shape. The line between imagination and reality blurred. The first victim, Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he picked up in June 1978, was a direct manifestation of these escalating compulsions. Jeffrey drove Hicks back to his now empty family home, offered him beer, and, when Hicks made to leave, attacked him. The murder was not premeditated in its specific victim, but the underlying urge, the desire to possess, to control, had been building for years. The act itself was a fumbling, desperate affair, a brutal initiation into the world of human predation. He strangled Hicks, then, in a chilling echo of his childhood fascination, dismembered the body, dissolved the remains in acid, and scattered the bones. The disposal of the body was methodical, almost clinical, yet driven by a frantic desire to erase the evidence. The experience, horrific as it was, provided Jeffrey with a perverse sense of power, a grim satisfaction that momentarily quelled the gnawing emptiness within him. The first crack had appeared in the dam, and a torrent of unimaginable depravity was poised to follow. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey attempted to resume a semblance of normal life. He enrolled at Ohio State University for a brief, unsuccessful period, dropping out due to his escalating alcohol abuse and inability to cope with academic demands. He then served in the U.S. Army as a medic for 2 years, an ironic twist for a man whose future would involve the systematic destruction of human life. His military career was marred by continued heavy drinking and insubordination, leading to an honorable discharge in 1981. The structure and discipline of the military, designed to mold individuals, failed to contain the monster stirring within him. Upon his return to civilian life, Jeffrey moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee. She was a kind, devout woman who offered him stability and a place to stay, hoping to help him get his life together. For a time, it seemed to work. He found odd jobs, even attended church with her. But beneath the facade of a struggling young man trying to find his way, the dark urges intensified, fueled by his continued isolation, his inability to form meaningful relationships, and his deepening alcoholism. The pressure of his suppressed desires, coupled with the continued emotional void, became unbearable. The first murder in Milwaukee in September 1987 came almost a decade after Stephen Hicks, signaling a terrifying escalation. The victim was Stephen Twomey, whom Dahmer met at a bar. The pattern began to solidify, targeting vulnerable individuals, often young men of color, from the city's gay bars, men who were often marginalized and less likely to be immediately reported missing. His grandmother, though a loving figure, was increasingly concerned by Jeffrey's erratic behavior, his heavy drinking, and the strange, foul odors emanating from his room. She would confront him, but he would always offer plausible, if vague, explanations. He was a master of deception, using his quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance to deflect suspicion. The murders, initially sporadic, became more frequent. He moved from his grandmother's house into his own apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee in 1988, believing this would grant him the absolute freedom he craved to indulge his fantasies without interruption. This new apartment, a stark, unremarkable space, would become his private charnel house, a hidden chamber of horrors where the quiet despair of his youth would finally, brutally, manifest itself as the horrific reality of Milwaukee's monster. The city, unaware of the darkness brewing within its unassuming buildings, was unknowingly welcoming a predator into its midst. Jeffrey Dahmer's move into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee in 1990 marked a terrifying turning point in his macabre career. This nondescript dwelling, nestled in a working-class neighborhood, became the crucible for his most horrific experiments and the final resting place for the majority of his victims. Here, free from the watchful, if naive, eye of his grandmother, Dahmer could finally indulge his darkest impulses without inhibition, transforming his quiet despair into a reign of terror that would leave a permanent scar on the city and the nation. His modus operandi evolved, becoming more refined, more chillingly efficient. He frequented gay bars in the inner city, preying on marginalized individuals, often young Black and Latino men who were less likely to be immediately missed or reported to the police. His victims were often young, vulnerable, and in need of money or a place to stay. Dahmer, charming in his quiet, unassuming way, would lure them back to his apartment with promises of drinks, drugs, or money. Once inside, the facade of friendly companionship would dissolve, replaced by a sinister agenda. The murders became increasingly ritualistic. Dahmer's primary motive was no longer just the act of killing, but the chilling desire for absolute control, for permanent possession of his victims. He sought to create a living dead slave, someone who would remain with him, compliant and silent. This led to his escalating use of drugging, often with sedatives, to incapacitate his victims before strangling them. The ultimate expression of this desire for control was his attempts at lobotomies, drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to render them docile and alive, yet completely subservient to his will. These horrific experiments, always failing, invariably led to the victims' deaths, fueling his frustration and intensifying his desire for the perfect victim. The disposal of the bodies became a grotesque science. Drawing on his childhood fascination with dissection and his experience in the military as a medic, Dahmer meticulously dismembered his victims, often in his bathtub. He used acid to dissolve flesh, bleached bones, and disposed of body parts in various ways. Flushed down the toilet, thrown in the trash, or stored in his refrigerator and freezer. The apartment, a testament to his gruesome activities, contained freezers filled with human heads, torsos, and limbs, skulls bleached clean, and a variety of tools for dismemberment. The sheer audacity and methodical nature of these acts, all hidden behind a locked door in an ordinary apartment building, defied belief. Despite his meticulous efforts, the stench emanating from apartment 213 became a persistent problem. Neighbors complained repeatedly to the building manager and the police about the foul odors, describing them as putrid, like rotting meat or chemicals. Some suspected a broken pipe, others, less charitably, assumed Dahmer was simply an unhygienic tenant. The complaints, however, were largely dismissed or inadequately investigated, a series of tragic bureaucratic failures that allowed Dahmer's reign of terror to continue. One particularly harrowing incident occurred in May 1991, when 14-year-old Connor Synthesumphone, one of Dahmer's victims, managed to escape from the apartment, dazed and bleeding. 3 Black women from the neighborhood, alerted by the commotion, intervened, attempting to help the disoriented boy. They flagged down 2 Milwaukee Police Department officers, John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish, who had just responded to a domestic disturbance call nearby. Dahmer, calm and collected, approached the scene. He convinced the officers that Konarak was his 19-year-old adult lover, involved in a domestic dispute and merely drunk. He claimed Konarak had a tendency to wander off when intoxicated and provided a plausible, albeit false, explanation for the boy's dazed state and minimal clothing. The officers, seemingly convinced by Dahmer's smooth demeanor and Konarak's inability to communicate due to being drugged, ignored the concerned pleas of the women, who insisted the boy was underage and in distress. They even ignored Konarak's frightened and dazed attempts to resist being led back to the apartment. In a horrifying display of racial bias and systemic failure, the officers returned Konarak to Dahmer's apartment. Within an hour, Konarak Synthesumphone was murdered, becoming one of Dahmer's last victims. The incident became a stark symbol of the police department's negligence and contributed significantly to the public outrage and calls for reform that followed Dahmer's eventual capture. The story of those officers returning Konarak to his killer would forever stain the reputation of the Milwaukee Police Department. Dahmer's escalating crimes and the growing complaints from neighbors eventually led to him being put on notice by his landlord. He continued his grotesque work, however, driven by an insatiable hunger and a deepening spiral of depravity. He began experimenting with cannibalism, believing it would grant him more complete control over his victims, that by consuming them, he could truly possess them forever. This was the ultimate violation, a final act of desecration that pushed him beyond the bounds of human comprehension. The victims continued to mount. Over the course of 1990 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 11 men in his apartment at 924 North 25th Street. Each disappearance, each life brutally extinguished, added to the growing whispers and unease within the community, even as the official channels remained frustratingly slow to connect the dots. The police, dealing with a city grappling with high crime rates, had no reason to suspect a serial killer operating with such depraved methods in a single, unassuming apartment building. They viewed individual missing persons reports as isolated incidents, not as pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The building itself had a diverse community, including a significant number of black families and individuals, many of whom felt marginalized by law enforcement. Their repeated complaints about the smell, the strange noises, and Dahmer's odd behavior were often dismissed, contributing to a sense of distrust and abandonment. This systemic neglect, combined with Dahmer's cunning ability to manipulate perceptions, created a perfect storm for his atrocities to continue unchecked. The end of Dahmer's reign came abruptly, on July 22, 1991. One of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from the apartment after a violent struggle. Edwards, terrified and desperate, flagged down two police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, telling them a man had tried to kill him. He led them back to the apartment, visibly shaken and agitated. As the officers approached apartment 213, they immediately noticed the strong, putrid odor, which was now undeniable. Edwards insisted Dahmer was dangerous, providing a chilling account of his escape. When they entered the apartment, the officers were met with an unspeakable scene of horror. They found Polaroid photographs of mutilated bodies and dismembered remains, an instant, undeniable confirmation of Edwards's terrifying story. One officer, upon opening Dahmer's refrigerator, recoiled in horror at the sight of a human head. The horrific truth behind the cannibal was finally, gruesomely, unveiled. Jeffrey Dahmer, who had been calmly cooperative up until that point, was immediately arrested. The discovery of multiple bodies, body parts, and evidence of cannibalism sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and the entire world. The apartment, once a hidden sanctuary for his depravity, became a gruesome crime scene, meticulously documented by forensic teams. The secrets it held were finally brought to light, revealing the unimaginable depths of depravity that had festered silently behind a locked door for so long. The nightmare that had silently plagued Milwaukee was over, but the horrific truth of Jeffrey Dahmer would haunt the city for generations. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer on July 22, 1991, ripped through the fabric of Milwaukee like a monstrous thunderclap, exposing a level of depravity that stunned the city, the nation, and indeed, the world. The unassuming man from apartment 213 was no longer just a source of foul smells. He was the Milwaukee Monster, a cannibalistic serial killer whose crimes defied human comprehension. The horrifying truth behind the cannibal was finally, agonizingly, laid bare. The immediate aftermath of his arrest was a maelstrom of activity. Forensic teams descended upon apartment 213, meticulously documenting every gruesome detail. The sheer volume of human remains, skulls, severed heads, torsos, limbs found in his refrigerator, freezer, and hidden in various corners of the apartment, was staggering. The air was thick with the stench of decay and chemicals, a physical manifestation of the evil that had permeated the space. Detectives, even hardened veterans, struggled to maintain their composure in the face of such unimaginable horrors. The discovery of Polaroid photographs, taken by Dahmer himself, chronicling his victims at various stages of dismemberment and desecration, provided irrefutable and utterly chilling evidence of his crimes. The news broke rapidly, igniting a media frenzy. National and international news outlets flocked to Milwaukee, transforming a working-class neighborhood into a global focal point of macabre fascination. The initial disbelief quickly turned to outrage, especially as the details of the police's prior negligence came to light, particularly the tragic incident involving Conorak's synthesymphone. The Milwaukee Police Department, already facing scrutiny, found itself under intense fire, accused of racial bias and gross incompetence. The fact that Dahmer's victims were predominantly black and gay men exacerbated the pain and anger within the community, sparking protests and demands for accountability. For many, it felt like their lives, their disappearances, were deemed less important by the authorities. Jeffrey Dahmer himself remained unsettlingly calm during his interrogation. He waived his Miranda rights and, over several days, provided a chillingly detailed confession, recounting his 17 murders with a detached, almost academic tone. He spoke of his morbid obsessions, necrophilia, cannibalism, and his desperate, futile attempts to create zombies or sex slaves he could control permanently. He described his methods, his failures, and his motivations or lack thereof with a terrifying lack of remorse. His voice, steady and quiet, delivered horrors that would forever haunt the interrogating officers. He did not seek forgiveness or understanding. He merely stated facts, as if cataloging a grotesque collection. The revelation of his cannibalism particularly shocked the public. The idea that a human being could consume another, especially in a modern American city, seemed unfathomable, bordering on the mythological. It added another layer of repulsion and fear to the already monstrous narrative. The image of the Milwaukee monster was cemented in the public consciousness, a chilling symbol of absolute depravity. The legal proceedings were relatively swift, given the overwhelming evidence and Dahmer's full confession. The primary legal strategy for the defense was to argue for insanity, claiming that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. Experts testified about his severe personality disorders, his necrophilia, and his paraphilias. However, the prosecution countered that while Dahmer was undoubtedly disturbed, he was not legally insane. They argued he understood his actions were wrong and went to great lengths to conceal his crimes, demonstrating a capacity for planning and premeditation. The trial was a gruesome spectacle, with victims' families forced to relive the horrors through graphic testimony and evidence. The raw emotion in the courtroom was palpable. The families, many of whom had searched desperately for their loved ones for months or even years, finally confronted the man who had stolen their sons, brothers, and fathers. Their victim impact statements were heartbreaking, pouring out years of grief, anger, and unimaginable pain. They spoke of the dreams shattered, the futures erased, and the indelible scars left on their lives. On February 15, 1992, after a tense trial, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, amounting to over 900 years in prison, ensuring he would never again walk free. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but not true healing, to the victims' families and the shaken city. The aftermath of the Dahmer case extended far beyond the courtroom. It forced a critical examination of systemic failures within law enforcement and society. The racial and homophobic biases that contributed to the dismissal of crucial warnings were undeniable. The case spurred police reform efforts in Milwaukee and highlighted the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities to such predators. It also sparked widespread public discourse on mental illness, the nature of evil, and the warning signs that are often missed. The apartment building at 924 North 25th Street, a monument to unimaginable suffering, was quickly demolished in 1992, the site now an empty lot. Neighbors, haunted by the memories and the lingering stigma, hoped its removal would help them move on. But the scars remained. The quiet neighborhood, once simply home, was now forever associated with the name Jeffrey Dahmer, a chilling reminder of the horrors that transpired within its walls. Jeffrey Dahmer's time in prison was relatively short. On November 28, 1994, less than 3 years after his conviction, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, at the Columbia Correctional Institution. His death, while bringing a controversial sense of justice to some, also closed the final chapter on one of America's most disturbing serial killers. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to haunt. His story is a perpetual reminder of the fragility of human life, the depths of depravity that can exist within an individual, and the societal factors that can allow such monsters to flourish. It underscores the importance of listening to marginalized voices, of thorough investigations, and of confronting uncomfortable truths. Milwaukee, a city that bravely confronted its nightmare, learned enduring lessons. While time has passed, the echoes of those horrific events still resonate. The name Jeffrey Dahmer will forever be synonymous with the Milwaukee Monster, a chilling testament to the horrific truth behind the cannibal, and a stark warning of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. The scars of his reign are permanent, etched into the memory of a city, a nation, and the annals of true crime history.